Have you ever attended a conference or read a great book or listened to somebody speak and walked away thinking, that's exactly what I needed? Everything clicked. You filled pages with notes. Ideas were connecting. You could already picture yourself making better decisions and communicating more clearly and leading with greater confidence. And for a while, it honestly felt like something had changed. And then Monday showed up. The emails started coming in. People needed answers. Your calendar filled up. A decision landed on your desk. Nothing especially complicated, but it did require clarity. Almost immediately, a familiar thought showed up. I think I need a little more information. So you waited. You made another phone call. You asked one more person, or you looked at one more report. And in the moment, it felt completely reasonable. Later that same day, another situation came up. A conversation needed to happen. Someone on your team wasn't meeting expectations. A customer needed a clearer answer, or a misunderstanding needed to be addressed. You already knew what needed to be said, and then another familiar thought quietly appeared. I don't want to create tension. So you softened the conversation, or maybe you postponed it and convinced yourself that tomorrow would probably be a better day. Neither of those moments felt especially significant. They just felt like normal leadership, ordinary decisions, ordinary conversations, ordinary days, right? But those ordinary moments, they shape our leadership far more than we often realize. You're listening to the Coffee and Clarity Show with Stephen Briggs. Real conversations, practical growth, and stronger leaders. Each week we spend a little time talking about mindset and leadership, personal growth, and the thinking that quietly shapes the way that we live and lead. Today's conversation is called The Inner Game of Leadership. Over the years, I've found that most leadership conversations focus on what we do. Today, I want to give you one layer underneath that. Because before execution improves, before consistency really becomes real, and before accountability actually holds when things get difficult, something else is already in motion. Most leaders never stop long enough to look at it. Instead, they focus on what to do next and adjust the behavior. Become more disciplined, right? Try to stay more consistent. Work harder, push a little more. And those things matter, but if the system driving those behaviors never changes, the results rarely last. Progress shows up for a little while, and then life speeds up. The same hesitation returns. The same internal conversations begin again. The same kind of decisions appear in slightly different situations. Most people, they think that they're struggling because they're confused. I don't think that's usually the problem. I think that they're dealing with familiarity. And here's why I think that this is such an important distinction. When we tell ourselves we're confused, we naturally assume that we need more information. Right? We look for another book, another podcast, another course, or another conversation. There's certainly nothing wrong with learning. In fact, learning is one of the best investments that we can make, right? But many leadership challenges aren't happening because we don't know enough. They're happening because our thinking has already become familiar. We've repeated certain internal responses so many times that they begin to feel normal. And we stop questioning them because they simply feel like the way we operate. So that's why two leaders can hear exactly the same advice and walk away with completely different results. One begins practicing a new way of thinking, and the other agrees with everything they heard, but quietly returns to the same internal patterns that they've been running for years. The difference isn't information, it's what becomes familiar. Leadership doesn't usually break down at the level of behavior, it breaks down at the level of what has been repeated internally. What you think repeatedly becomes what you naturally default to, and what you naturally default to eventually becomes how you lead. When nothing changes underneath, nothing holds for very long on the surface. That's why someone can attend a conference and fill pages with notes and feel completely inspired and still find themselves operating much the same way a week later. Not because they didn't learn anything, not because the speaker wasn't good, but because information doesn't override what's already been practiced. Repetition does. That's what we're really talking about today, the inner side of leadership, the part that's always running whether you pay attention to it or not. And once that begins to change, leadership starts becoming more consistent without feeling like you're forcing yourself every day. Most leaders judge themselves by what they did. Did I follow through? Right? Did I communicate clearly? Did I make the right decision? And those questions matter, but they're not where leadership begins. Your leadership standard is being established long before your actions ever appear. It's being shaped by what your mind repeatedly allows without interruption. Think about a leader who regularly tells themselves, I need a little more time before I decide, or I don't want to create tension, or I should probably wait until I'm more certain. Those thoughts, they don't stay inside their head. They become direction. Over time, that leader isn't simply being cautious. They're getting used to delaying. They're training hesitation without realizing they're doing it. And this is where it often gets missed. It feels like a fresh choice every time, but many times it isn't. It's what's already been practiced showing up once again. Imagine that you're standing at the edge of a forest and you've walked one path every day for years. It's wide, smooth, and easy to follow, right? You don't even have to think about it anymore. But now imagine somebody tells you that there's a better path. It's only a few feet away, but no one has walked it yet. And so the grass is tall, the branches are in the way, you have to pay attention to every step. And so that's what a new leadership response feels like. It's there, but it takes effort. The old response is different. It's like a paved highway, fast, automatic, and easy to access, right? So when life speeds up, you don't stop to build a new road. You naturally take the one that you've been driving all along. The interesting thing about the new path is that at first it doesn't feel natural. It feels slower. You have to think about every step. Sometimes it even feels like you're forcing yourself because you no longer are operating on autopilot. So that's one of the reasons people give up too soon. They assume that if a new way of thinking feels difficult, it must not be right. And I actually think the opposite is often true. When you've spent years reinforcing one pattern of thinking, a healthier pattern is going to feel unfamiliar for a while. And it's not because it's wrong, it's simply because it hasn't been repeated enough yet. And so every time you intentionally choose that healthier response, you're taking another step down the new path. And you might not notice much difference after one decision or one conversation, but over time, that path becomes easier to follow. And eventually, what once required conscious effort begins to feel natural. That's when real change starts to stick. You haven't just changed a behavior, you've begun changing what your mind naturally reaches for. That's why you don't become a different leader in the moment that matters. You reveal the leader that you've been practicing becoming. And that's how these habits get locked in, not through one dramatic decision, but through quiet repetition. Your brain is constantly answering one simple question. What do we do in situations like this? It answers based on what you've shown it over and over again. So when life speeds up, there usually isn't time to build something completely new. Your mind runs what already feels familiar. And that's why two leaders with similar experience can respond so differently to the same situation. Right? One is trained clarity, the other has trained hesitation. Both might care, both might be experienced, both might want to lead well, but they've been rehearsing different responses. James Allen wrote, "Men do not attract that which they want, but that which they are." And so there's a leadership principle in that. Your results begin following your identity, and your identity is being shaped by what you repeatedly allow and reinforce internally. And if that doesn't change, your leadership ceiling doesn't change either, even if your effort increases. And so that's where so much frustration comes from. You work harder, you stay later, you read more books, you attend more conferences, and you even listen to more podcasts. And yet you still find yourself responding in familiar ways. Not because you're not trying, but because you're trying to produce different behavior from the same internal setup. Effort can help you for a while, but effort alone can't carry long-term change. Leadership follows the patterns that you rehearse every single day. It isn't built in the moment that it's needed. It shows up in the moment it's tested. So what you consistently run internally eventually becomes what you naturally rely on externally. Repetition builds familiarity, and familiarity builds speed, and speed becomes your automatic response. Whatever you repeat most becomes the fastest option available when life starts moving quickly. If hesitation is familiar, you're going to access hesitation quickly. If clarity is familiar, you're going to access clarity quickly. And so that speed matters because leadership moments rarely give you unlimited time to think. You can know exactly what the right decision is and still default to what you've practiced. Your leadership keeps moving in the direction of your most dominant thoughts because those thoughts are shaping your internal responses long before anyone sees your actions. So instead of only asking, what should I do differently next time, ask, what have I been practicing so often that it now feels automatic? And once you answer that honestly, you stop trying to fix isolated moments and you start changing what is producing them. That's where real change begins, not at the surface, but at the source. If your leadership follows what you've rehearsed every day, then pressure becomes the moment where that rehearsal shows up. And most people, they treat pressure like it's the issue, a difficult conversation, a decision with real consequences, a moment where people are watching and waiting for direction. And they tell themselves, I just need to handle this better. But pressure usually isn't creating the response, it's speeding up what's already there. Whatever you've been practicing quietly, pressure brings to the surface quickly. If a leader has been building clarity and ownership and decisiveness, pressure narrows their focus. If a leader has been reinforcing hesitation or second guessing and avoidance, pressure brings those patterns forward too. And so that's why pressure can feel uncomfortable. It exposes what hasn't been trained yet. And so I think this is one of the biggest misunderstandings in leadership. People often say, I wasn't myself today. They assume the pressure made them react in a way that's out of character. And I'm not convinced that that's actually what usually happens. More often than not, pressure strips away the extra time that we normally have to think things through. It removes that luxury of second guessing and it exposes the response that we've been practicing all along. And so that's why pressure can actually become one of our greatest teachers. It shows us where our thinking is already strong and it shows us where it still needs work. So instead of viewing those moments as failures, we can start seeing them as feedback. They answer a very important question. What has my thinking been preparing me for? Once you begin asking that question, pressure becomes less about surviving difficult moments and more about discovering what needs to change before the next one arrives. You see this in decision making, and a decision needs to be made, right? One leader moves forward with clarity, even though the answer might not be perfect. And another one keeps gathering more information and more opinions and more reports and more time. And from the outside, both can look thoughtful. Sometimes delay is wisdom, right? Sometimes it's responsible leadership. But sometimes it's fear wearing a better outfit. And you see the same thing in communication, right? A conversation needs to happen. One leader addresses it respectfully and directly, and another softens it, works around it, and hints at the same issue or puts it off until another day. And that isn't random, it's rehearsed. You can even feel it in a leader's presence. Some leaders, they walk into a room and they bring steadiness with them. They're not pretending everything is perfect. They're just simply clear enough internally that the room doesn't have to carry their uncertainty. And then other leaders, they bring uncertainty into the room before they even say a word. That presence is the result of what they've been reinforcing internally. Pressure simply just makes it louder. So why does pressure seem to speed everything up? Think about your phone when the battery drops to 1%, right? It starts shutting things down. Background apps close. Extra functions stop running. Everything shifts towards preserving that little bit of energy that remains, right? Your brain does something similar. When pressure increases, it usually doesn't slow down to think more deeply. It tries to move faster. And when it wants to move faster, it looks for the most familiar path. Notice I didn't say the best path, right? The familiar path. Familiar doesn't mean right, it just means practiced. And so when life speeds up, your brain usually isn't asking, what is the best possible response? It's asking, what response do we already know how to run? And then it runs it. And so that's why you've probably walked away from a meeting thinking, I knew exactly what I should have done, or I knew what I wanted to say, but I didn't say it. That's the gap between knowledge and conditioning. Knowledge is easy to access when life slows down. Conditioning is what you rely on, though, when it doesn't. Leadership doesn't always give you the luxury of slowing everything down. And so let me show you what that looks like. A leader is running their team, and things are moving. Nothing unusual, really, right? Then something breaks. A supplier misses a deadline. A major customer has a problem. The schedule is suddenly at risk. And so people start looking to the leader for direction. Two leaders face exactly the same situation. One steps in, makes the best decision they can with the information available to them, and they communicate it clearly, and they adjust as new information comes in. Keeps everyone moving, and then the other leader, though, pauses. They want more data, more input, more certainty, right? So they ask for another report. They bring another person into the conversation. They keep talking instead of deciding. And from the outside, it looks like caution. But underneath it, it's hesitation. And hesitation didn't begin that morning. It has been practiced. And think about everything that happened before that moment, right? A conversation that needed to be direct, they softened it. A decision that could have been made, they delayed it. In a situation where clarity was needed, they waited. And those weren't isolated events, they were repetitions. And so when the bigger moment arrived, they didn't suddenly become a different leader. They defaulted to the leader that they've been rehearsing all along. And so that's why I think pressure gets misunderstood. People assume pressure caused the problem, but it didn't. It revealed it. Pressure is honest. It doesn't adjust itself for your intentions, and it doesn't stop and consider what you meant to do, right? It doesn't wait until you've had the time to think everything through. It simply reveals what your thinking has been preparing you for. Viktor Frankl wrote, "Between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response." Right? That space exists. The challenge is that many of us don't access it consistently because our familiar responses are moving so quickly. And so the more you've practiced a response, the smaller that space begins to feel. And so that's why we don't wait until pressure arrives to become a different leader. We train ourselves before the pressure ever comes. When life is relatively calm, that's when we slow our thinking. That's when we notice hesitation. That's when we replace old responses with healthier ones. Because if we practice them often enough, eventually they become familiar too. And then something interesting begins to happen, right? You don't react as quickly. You don't delay as long. You don't avoid as often. And it's not because you're forcing yourself every single time. It's because you've trained a different response. And so this week, begin paying attention. Where do you hesitate when a decision needs to be made? Where do you soften when clarity is needed? Where do you delay when taking action would actually move things forward? Those aren't reasons to become discouraged. They're indicators. They're showing you what has become automatic. Pressure is going to continue revealing those patterns until you change what you're practicing. So leadership doesn't change in the moment that you need it. It changes in the repetitions leading up to it. That's the shift. And pressure becomes useful when it shows you exactly where you need to grow. Right? Now that raises the next question. If your internal habits are shaping how you lead and pressure is revealing those habits, how do you actually change them? Awareness is the beginning, but awareness by itself isn't enough. You can recognize a habit, right? And you can understand why you did it, and you can even call it out after it happens, and still find yourself doing the exact same thing tomorrow. Because this doesn't change simply through understanding, right? It changes through training. You're not trying to stop an old way of thinking. You're building a healthier one until it becomes the most familiar response. And that only happens through repetition. There are 3 parts to this process, and they're simple to understand, but this is where discipline begins to matter. The first step is to interrupt the pattern. Every habit has a moment when it first appears. Hesitation, right? Delay, overthinking, avoiding a conversation. That moment is your opportunity. Not after the situation is over, not on the drive home, right? Not tomorrow morning, right then though. You catch it, you recognize it, you name it. I'm hesitating again. I'm putting this off again. I'm softening something that needs clarity. That awareness creates a gap, and that gap gives you an opportunity to respond differently. And so without that step, nothing changes. You'll just keep running the same response without even realizing it. And so the second step, though, is replacing the pattern. Once you've interrupted it, you need something to replace it with. Not something vague, but something clear. If your habit is hesitation, your replacement might become, I move forward with clarity even when everything isn't perfect. If your habit is avoiding conversations, maybe you could say, I address things directly and early. If your habit is overthinking decisions, you could say, I decide, adjust, and keep moving. Notice those aren't dramatic statements, right? They're just practical. They're believable. Because the goal isn't to convince yourself of something unrealistic. The goal really is to give your mind a healthier path to follow before the old one takes over. Most leaders, they miss this step. They try to stop the old response, but they never intentionally install a new one. When pressure returns, the brain naturally goes back to the road it's traveled the most. And so I think this is where a lot of people become discouraged. They interrupt the old thought once or twice and they replace it with something healthier. And for a few days, they feel like they're making progress. And then one busy afternoon, they catch themselves slipping back into the old response. And that's usually the moment that they start believing that they failed. I don't think that they failed at all. I just think that they're experiencing something completely normal. The old pattern has simply had more repetitions, right? Imagine you've walked that old path thousands of times over the years. It shouldn't surprise us that our minds naturally find it again. And so the answer isn't becoming frustrated with yourself. The answer is giving the new path more repetitions. Every time you interrupt the old response and intentionally choose the healthier one, you're teaching your brain something new. You might not notice dramatic change today or even next week, but repetition has a way of quietly changing what eventually feels normal. One day you'll just respond differently and realize you didn't have to force it. And so that's when you know that your thinking is beginning to change from the inside out. And so that's why the replacement has to be intentional and clear and repeatable, right? And so now the third step is reinforcing the new pattern. This is where the real shift happens. Not because you interrupted the pattern once, not because you replaced it once, because you repeated the new response often enough that it gradually became familiar. Again, repetition builds familiarity. Familiarity builds speed, and speed builds consistency. So you begin practicing the new response in ordinary situations, small decisions, right? Everyday conversations, moments that don't feel especially important, because that's where your default is actually built. And then when life speeds up, you don't have to force a different response. You've already trained one. Now, if you think about the leader who reads the books and attends the conferences and listens to the podcast, they know the principles. They're not lacking information, right? And then something goes wrong and a decision has to be made and people are waiting. Instead of stepping in with clarity, they hesitate, right? Not completely, just enough to slow everything down. And so they want more certainty and more information and more time. And later that evening, they're driving home thinking, I knew exactly what I should have done. That isn't a knowledge problem. It's a practice response problem. And so now rewind a few days. Nothing dramatic is happening, just an ordinary Tuesday. An email maybe comes in about a team issue. And then you think, I'll deal with it later. A small decision comes up. I need a little more time. A conversation could happen today. It gets pushed to tomorrow. None of those moments feel especially important, but every single one of them is another repetition. Every one of them is teaching your brain, this is how we respond in situations like this. And so the more often that response is repeated, the easier it becomes to access. You're trying to become more decisive while quietly rehearsing hesitation, right? You're trying to become more direct while repeatedly practicing avoidance. And then pressure arrives. Your brain doesn't ask what you hope to become. It reaches for what you've practiced becoming. And so that's why willpower eventually runs out. That's why motivation fades. That's why simply knowing the right answer isn't enough. In those moments, you aren't building a response. You're running one that has already been trained. So maybe the better question isn't, what should I do next? Maybe the better question is, what am I training myself to do without even realizing it? Because whatever your answer is, that's what most likely is going to show up when it matters. You don't rise to brand new standards under pressure. You fall back on what you've been reinforcing all along. Consistency in leadership doesn't come from trying harder. It comes from training better responses. If you don't change what you rehearse, you won't change what you rely on. Real consistency is built through intentional mindset rewiring. You're deciding, this is how I think in situations like this now. This is how I respond in situations like this now. This is how I lead moving forward. And then you repeat those responses until they become automatic. And so that's how identity changes. Not through one dramatic moment, but through repeated alignment between the way that you think and the way that you act. As that alignment grows, leadership becomes steadier, more predictable, more effective. Not because you're forcing it, but because it's become the person that you're practicing being. So here's what I'd like you to leave with today. Your leadership isn't built in the moments everyone else sees. It's built in what you practice every day when no one else is paying attention. Pressure will continue revealing those patterns to you, not to work against you, but to show you exactly where you're ready to grow. So instead of trying to fix every situation as it comes, try and start training what's behind the situation. Interrupt what isn't helping you. Replace it with something stronger. Reinforce it until it becomes familiar. Because you're always moving in the direction of your most dominant thoughts. And when those thoughts begin to change, your leadership begins to change with them. And so one of the things I've learned over the years is that lasting leadership rarely changes in dramatic moments. We all enjoy the breakthrough story, right? We like to hear about the day everything finally clicked. And those moments, they certainly happen. And when they do, they're worth celebrating. But most of the leaders that I've seen grow consistently didn't change because of one extraordinary day. They changed because they kept practicing ordinary decisions differently. They kept having the conversation that they would have avoided before. They made the decision that they would have delayed 6 months earlier. Or they caught the familiar thought before it became the familiar response. And little by little, those new responses stopped feeling awkward and they started feeling natural. And so that's why I hope you don't leave today thinking that you have to become a completely different leader this week. Because you don't, right? You simply need to become a little more intentional than you were yesterday. Because leadership isn't built by one extraordinary decision. It's built by thousands of ordinary ones that most people never notice. And so if you actually have a cup of coffee with you right now, take a sip. If not, just pause for a moment and reflect on this question. What thought have I been repeating so often that it's becoming my automatic response? Don't think first about the behavior. Think about the thought underneath it. That's where lasting leadership change begins. Don't rush to answer it. Just be honest with yourself, because awareness is always the beginning of meaningful change. And so here's your clarity challenge. This week, choose one thinking pattern that you want to change. Just one. Notice when it shows up. Interrupt it. Replace it with the healthier response that you've already chosen. And then repeat that process every chance that you get. Not everything at once, just one pattern. You're not measuring perfection. You're building familiarity. And the responses that become familiar eventually become the responses that you naturally rely on. Leadership isn't built by occasional moments of inspiration. It's built by consistent moments of intention. Thank you for spending part of your day with me. You've been listening to the Coffee and Clarity Show. I'm Stephen Briggs, and I hope you join me again next time as we continue having real conversations about mindset, leadership, and personal growth. Until then, think about what you think about, because you're always moving in the direction of your mind's most dominant thoughts. And when those thoughts begin to change, the way that you lead begins to change with them.